Hey everyone, my name is Jack. Welcome to the channel. I talk about a variety of topics as they relate to personal finance, real estate, investing, and all of that sort of stuff. In this video, I want to talk about a very recent headline, and that is that Simon Property Group has sued Gap for $66 million in back rent. $66 million is a lot of money, even for a very large mall REIT like Simon Property Group. So how did we end up getting here? For those of you who follow the channel, you'll know that I've already done a video many weeks back about how retailers were beginning to withhold rent in relation to the crisis, since many governments had put in executive orders and that sort of thing to shut down retail operations to try and prevent the spread of the pandemic. And because of those orders, as well as people getting generally more fearful, and now a lot of people just simply not having jobs and having less money to spend on things like retail, a lot of retailers decided that it was in their best interest to withhold rent and just hope for the best, hope for a bailout or something like that, rather than fork over their very precious cash to their landlords, even though they had a contractual obligation in their lease to actually pay that rent. Now, on the flip side, landlords sometimes accepted this. They said, okay, we'll defer rent, but you're going to have to pay us back at some point, but we're okay with not having you pay rent while we get through this crisis, since we understand that you don't have a lot of revenue, you might not be comfortable forking over all the cash that you have just to pay rent, only to have none the next month. So a lot of landlords were accepting that. However, not every landlord is in that position. Many landlords have plenty of their own obligations, including maintaining debt and paying investors, and all of that is still very important to landlords. So just because retailers might be slightly more vulnerable than landlords doesn't mean that the landlords themselves aren't vulnerable too. Now, Simon Property Group is a very large mall REIT that has over 200 malls in their gigantic portfolio. It's one of the biggest mall portfolios in the world, if not the biggest. And they have a lot of very nice malls in there as well. And Gap actually makes up 3.5% of their rent roll, at least normally Gap does. Gap being one of their largest retail tenants. Now, specifically Gap, and this Gap is the very famous clothing store, actually has over 400 properties that they lease from Simon Property. So they are a very, very important tenant to Simon Property and pay obviously a lot of rent if we're up to a $66 million backlog to Simon Property. Simon Property's share price has dramatically decreased, partly with the overarching decline of brick and mortar retail that's come with things like Amazon and e-commerce taking a large market share of consumers, basically. You have a lot of pressure already on retail. So this crisis was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot, or might be, maybe it hasn't been yet, but it's really pushing downward pressure on these share prices for many of the larger retail REITs like Simon Property. Simon Property is actually one of the REITs in my retail section of the larger real estate REIT portfolio that I made with M1 Finance, and I showed that on this channel a few weeks back. I'll go ahead and link to that above if you want to take a look at that portfolio. It's generally just a great way to get diversified into the real estate industry if you're looking to do that. Maybe not now, but if you see opportunities down the road with there certainly will probably be a lot of opportunities that will come later this summer, I would imagine, as a lot of debt payments are going to be backlogged as well. You're going to have all these rent conflicts. I think this Gap versus Simon Property thing is going to be the first of potentially many sorts of conflicts between landlords and their tenants, even larger tenants who have withheld rent for quite some time. So if you want to take a look at that portfolio, I'm not a financial advisor, but hopefully it's a good start to your portfolio if you're looking to diversify your real estate holdings or just get kind of a one-stop shop for your real estate investment strategy. But definitely take a look at it. It's a free platform, M1 Finance, and I've covered it many times in this channel before. So I have an affiliate link in the description if you want to take a look at that portfolio. But back to this conflict, Gap actually has fired most of their frontline retail workers and has recently fired 10% of their corporate staff as well in an effort to hold down costs. They've also stopped issuing their dividend and are really trying to conserve cash. Obviously, they're withholding rent as well in a way to really conserve cash, but this is clearly angering its biggest landlord, Simon Property. And Simon Property has allowed certain retailers or certain tenants to actually withhold rent through some sort of deferment agreement. However, it said that it did not make agreements with every single tenant, and it was going to be doing it individually with each tenant, not having some blanket rule that would allow all of their tenants to do this. Clearly GAAP was not on that allowed list, so now we're reaching this conflict now because clearly they haven't come up with any sort of agreement. It's going to be interesting to see what actually happens with this lawsuit. I would imagine there would be some sort of settlement before it actually reaches the end, but I'm going to guess GAAP is going to try to stall as long as possible until things can reopen. They're set to reopen many hundreds of their stores very soon as states are starting to open up, but they're still very low on revenue right now, just like so many other retailers. But ultimately, GAAP does have a contractual obligation to pay rent. The question is, do they have an out through something like force majeure, which is basically like if there's an act of God or something like that, like a pandemic potentially, they might be able to get out of paying rent, though that's very unlikely, at least given current law. That could change, as the law is always changing, but we'll see what will happen with this. My guess is GAAP will be liable for technically all of the rent, but they'll probably come to some sort of agreement to get out of the lawsuit and move forward, since I doubt that Simon Property wants to burn its bridge with such a large tenant that makes up 3.5% of its rent roll. And this could be a move by Simon Property to show that they're not messing around with all of their other tenants who are probably doing similar things, because if they show that they're not afraid to go after their tenants to get their money, then ideally, in Simon Property's view, their other tenants won't continue to withhold rent when asked to pay it. It could also be a sign of desperation by Simon Property Group to try and boost their share price and just get back in the swing of things, because I'm sure their revenue has been hit very hard in recent weeks just with this pandemic and all of the withheld rent. So what's next for Simon Property, GAAP, and all of the other retailers out there who might be facing the same problem, or all the landlords are facing the same problem? Well, I imagine, like I mentioned, that this conflict between GAAP and Simon Property will probably end in some sort of settlement, I would imagine, and GAAP will probably still be on the hook for most, if not all, of the rent, and they'll end up paying at least most of it to Simon Property through some sort of agreement, maybe not in a lump sum, but maybe tacking it on to current rent payments or something like that once things start opening up. This crisis has certainly really hit retailers extremely hard, and I'm sure Simon Property knows that GAAP, even though they're a large company, might not have the free cash available to actually pay their rent for quite some time. On the flip side, GAAP, I'm sure, realizes that Simon Property does have quite a bit of leverage, since they have a lot of brick and mortar stores that are very crucial to GAP's operation, so they wouldn't want to lose those or get evicted somehow, because that would be pretty messy. But GAP perhaps is using this as an opportunity to just buy time and stall as long as possible. Maybe they do have the cash available to pay most of this rent, but are deciding to take the more, I guess you could call it, conservative route to make sure that they don't run out of cash, even if they can still cover this rent right now. But it looks like their clock is starting to run out, because Simon Property is taking the offensive right now to try and get that rent from GAAP in one way or another. But this could be a much larger pattern for other retailers and landlords throughout the nation. As many retailers, Subway was one that threatened to withhold rent in those prior weeks that I mentioned. So we'll see if other retailers are going to start getting into conflicts with their landlords as things start to open up, and landlords are like, all right, everyone, it's open again, we need our cash, so start paying up. You agreed to this lease. Doesn't matter that times were tough, you still have to pay rent. Please, come on, give us our money back. Whereas retailers are going to be like, well, we didn't have any money to get. This is a super unusual circumstance. The government told us we couldn't open our stores, so we can't give you all this money. Maybe we'll give you some, but we definitely can't pay you the full amount. Maybe it's going to look something like that, probably on a broader scale. If any of these do go all the way through the court system, you're definitely going to want to pay attention to some of those first rulings, and that'll set a very clear precedent for as to how landlords and tenants should expect these conflicts to end. Because the courts know that this is an unusual circumstance as well. A lot of real estate law is handled state to state, so it's not as though the law in California is going to look the same as the law in Tennessee, but we'll see what happens. States will often sort of borrow law from each other as trends develop, and this could be a very important trend for retailers and landlords alike, not only for this specific situation, but for well beyond this. If we ever have another sort of similar crisis, or some sort of government-mandated quarantine that limits retailers' ability to actually bring in revenue, and then pay rent. But whether you care about Simon Property Group or GAAP, definitely take a look at my links down in the description for Webull and Robinhood. If you open up both, you'll actually get up to 3 free stocks from the 2 platforms that you can then sell off to use to buy whatever sort of REIT you want, or just take the cash and go buy some clothes at GAAP. Definitely make sure to like this video if you found it helpful or interesting. I'll be posting new content about personal finance, real estate, investing, and all of that sort of stuff in the coming weeks and beyond, so definitely be sure to subscribe as well. But until next time, take care.